Hello, hello, hello. I remember being in Vegas, and they had all these birds that can talk, like parrots or whatever. And there was one that would just say hello. It was so creepy. I still have nightmares. Hello. Normally they're supposed to go hello, hello. This one would just go hello, hello. This week we celebrate mark the 20th anniversary of George W. Bush's illegal invasion of Iraq. This is the week we mark the 20th anniversary of George W. Bush's illegal invasion of Iraq. But somehow, the ex president about to get perp walked this week is Donald Trump. Interesting. I think the feds might have forgotten about an ex president living down in Texas. What do you think? Leave a comment in the comment section below. I read all your comments, and it helps shape my program. I'm David Feldman. This is the Mop Up. The United Nations was correct before 9/11 and after 9/11. It was correct before we invaded Iraq and after we invaded Iraq. America, on the other clenched fist, America got everything wrong, everything. And that would mostly be George W. Bush's fault. From ignoring intelligence briefings that warned bin Laden was determined to bring down buildings using hijacked jets, to bombing and then invading Afghanistan, to blaming bombing and invading Iraq, our 22-year war on terrorism turned us into the terrorists. It turned our military into unsupervised sadists, murderers, and rapists. We did everything wrong. And by any measure of international law, this foolish war on terror that continues to this day has made us less safe while making all Americans citizens of a rogue nation. We are a rogue nation because of this war on terror that will not end. This is from Brown University's Cost of War. I recommend it highly. 38 million, that's what Brown University says, is the number of war refugees and displaced persons from George W. Bush's war on terror. Brown University says over 929,000 people have died. Lancet, the British Medical Journal, would disagree. They would much higher. The Cost of War over at Brown University says more than 387,000 civilians have been killed as a result of the fighting. America has spent $5.6 trillion. The 387,000 civilians, that's way too low. America has spent $5.6 trillion on the war in Iraq. And because the war was funded almost entirely through debt, interest costs on the war in Iraq could be at least $7 trillion by 2053. Let's look at more from Brown University's The Cost of War. They're getting some numbers a little low from what I've been reading. The war on terror, the U.S. government, says Brown University, is conducting counter-terror activities in 85 countries. Who authorized that? The Brown University Cost of War study says more than 7,050 U.S. soldiers have died in these wars. I don't know what that means. That's not even close to, that's not right. So let me move on. That is too vague. Sorry about that. Well, America is my country, and while I take responsibility for what we have done, as you all should here in America, the real villain, the real villains who caused all this suffering, Bush, Cheney, Rice, Wolfowitz, Fife, Libby, and Fleischer, McClellan, have yet to apologize or be held accountable. Donald Rumsfeld and Colin Powell died, never forced to answer for themselves. I am an American, and we cannot heal until we have a reckoning with the destruction we have inflicted on others and ourselves. This war on terror, Bush's, Cheney's war on terror, flushed 22 years down the toilet. I demand justice. Those who say, why litigate the past, are not forgiving. You are not a forgiving, benevolent soul by saying, why litigate the past? You are enabling future war crimes to come. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, well, they continued long after they disappeared off our front pages. It silently began to infect our politics, leaving voters confused as to why we are so divided, so sad, and broken. I believe Bush's unnecessary and illegal invasion of Iraq, his wanton disregard for human life overseas, unleashed a wanton disregard for human life here at home. America lost its way after the Supreme Court handed the presidency to George W. Bush. At the time, we thought it was just going to be a short 4-year hiccup. Instead, George W. Bush's ignorance, arrogance, and thirst for vengeance, cloaked in religion and homespun nationalism, drained our entire country of all hope and stature. Besides being a war criminal several times over, George W. Bush is without a doubt the most destructive president this country ever had. Trump, who they're going to frog march tomorrow, doesn't even come close. In 2001, Bill Clinton handed George W. Bush, a Republican who ran as the fiscal conservative. In 2001, Bill Clinton handed George W. Bush a budget surplus. I know that term is alien to most Americans these days, so just in case you think you didn't hear me correctly, George W. Bush took office with a $230 billion budget surplus, the largest in American history. Some of my older listeners might remember the term lockbox during the 2000 debates. If you remember, Gore and Bush were arguing over what to do with all that extra money the government had lying around. Extra money lying around. Gore wanted to put it in a lockbox, but Bush decided, after he got elected, to give the wealthy and powerful tax cuts. And he marshaled an army of phony economists who told the rich and the powerful what they wanted to hear. These economists guaranteed that you can fight 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that's how you pay for it all, by lowering taxes. It made absolutely no sense. Fight 2 wars, pay for it by lowering taxes. It made no sense. But hey, if you're rich, shut your mouth and take the money. Like I said, the cost of the war is astronomical. We'll be paying for this. The interest alone could be as much as, $8 trillion by the time we're done paying off this war in Iraq? $8 trillion just in interest alone. Forget the human suffering. That's just too painful for me to think about right now. Where is the accountability, the shame, the apology, and most importantly, as we're about to frog march Donald Trump, where is the criminal prosecution? Trump is going on trial this week for paying hush money to a porn star, while Bush is on his Texas ranch painting and clearing brush. Don't get me wrong, Donald Trump belongs in prison along with the rest of that family of his. But in terms of sheer numbers, no American president has ever come close to inflicting as much damage to America and the world as George W. Bush. These days, he paints his wounded soldiers instead of penning a dispatch to future generations on how never to repeat his presidency. Trading off her family name, Bush's daughter earns millions these days hosting the Today Show while insisting her dad is just a goofball and fun-loving, doting father. I'm sure he is, because evil comes in spurts. Evil comes in spurts. I'm also told visitors to the Wolf's Lair couldn't get over what a gracious host Adolf Hitler turned out to be. In the end, a republic, a democracy, is only as good as its leadership, and no amount of civic responsibility can turn the tide on pure, unadulterated evil. No president in modern American history was capable of George W. Bush's evil. It was unimaginable that anybody could be as evil as George W. Bush. Even Lyndon Baines Johnson, who lied us into Vietnam, even LBJ had the human decency to realize the war was wrong, and he refused to run for re-election. Vietnam was evil, but at least LBJ gave us Medicare, Medicaid, as well as the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. George W. Bush gave us nothing but death. Katrina and capitalism. He literally killed capitalism in 2008. George W. Bush gave us nothing but death. He did not deserve to be reelected. And it was his reelection campaign of 2004 that created today's political climate. He fired federal attorneys who wouldn't bring phony voter fraud cases. He put anti-LGBTQ measures on state ballots that would energize all the conservatives who were disappointed by the way Iraq was turning out. So he figured, put some anti-LGBTQ measures on the ballot, and the conservatives, the Republicans, will come out, vote their intolerance for the LGBTQ, and stick around and vote for the cretin, George W. Bush. He also, the draft dodger, George W. Bush, ran an off-the-books character assassination of John Kerry and his record in Vietnam, a war Bush's father pulled countless strings so W could sit it out. There are bad people, and they must be identified, labeled bad and evil, so we can protect ourselves from them. George W. Bush is evil. Dick Cheney is evil. There is evil in this world, and these two men, Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, are as evil as all the guilty men on death row combined, and then multiply it by 1 million dead Iraqi citizens. How did Bush and Cheney get away with this? Well, even after the lessons from Vietnam, it still remained impossible for some to imagine the depths of depravity lurking within the Bush White House. These two, Bush and Cheney, were masters of subterfuge. They were way too efficient at back-channel intimidation and manipulation. Their resumes betrayed their claims to being Washington outsiders. They knew exactly how the system worked because they were the system. A nonprofit journalism group conducted a far-reaching and meticulous study in 2008 and concluded that in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, Bush and 7 of his top advisors, including Vice President Cheney, Condi Rice, Ari Fleischer, and Scott McClellan, together made 935 false statements. 935 false statements about Iraq having WMDs. 935 false statements about Iraq being close to having WMDs. 935 false statements about Iraq playing a major role in 9/11. A lot of these lies were told during congressional testimony. Where is the criminal prosecution? This is from the Center of Public Integrity. They wrote in 2008 that, let me pull this up. That's not how you do it, moron. Here we go. The Center for Public Integrity in 2008 wrote, in speeches, briefings, interviews, testimony. That means they swore to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth under the threat of perjury. In speeches, briefings, interviews, testimony, Bush, along with Secretary of State Colin Powell, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, and White House Press Secretaries Ari Fleischer and Scott McClellan, stated unequivocally that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction or was trying to produce or obtain them, links to Al-Qaeda, or both. This war in Iraq alone, the war in Iraq just by itself makes George W. Bush a criminal. But as usual, the only ones forced to pay the price were our soldiers, the Iraqi people, and of course, the American taxpayer. The United Nations was correct back then, and the United Nations is correct right now about Ukraine, which is why we should only be listening to Secretary General Antonio Guterres and ignore Joe Biden, as well as everyone else in the American government, on issues of war and peace. Because on issues of war and peace, our entire government, media, and houses of higher learning have clearly lost their last remaining tatters of moral authority. There is no moral authority in America, anywhere, when it comes to issues of war and peace. So this week we mark the 20th anniversary of George W. Bush's illegal, criminal invasion of Iraq. I'd call it the single worst thing America ever did to another country that never attacked us, but that's unfair to Afghanistan, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, all of whom never attacked us either. What makes Iraq different is it's also the single worst thing America has ever done to itself. So nothing comes close. Absolutely nothing. Some thoughts on Afghanistan. You really can't understand how Iraq happened until you understand why there are some Americans who think I erred just now by including Afghanistan in my list of countries we invaded, even though they never attacked us. I know this is difficult for most Americans. Afghanistan never attacked us on 9/11. They had nothing to do with it. Both presidential candidates, Barack Obama and John Kerry, lied when they said Iraq was the bad war, Afghanistan the good one. Both wars were the bad ones. Americans would know that if, to paraphrase David Swanson, all war wasn't a lie. Donald Trump did one thing for America. In 2016, he made it settled law in the Republican Party that the invasion of Iraq was a disastrous mistake, while at the same time debasing and humiliating Jeb Bush for even entertaining the idea that anyone in that family deserved to sit at the head table inside the Situation Room. While I do look forward to Trump's criminal prosecution, this was no small achievement. And while most Americans now no longer think Iraq was behind 9/11, they still mistakenly believe Afghanistan and the Taliban were. It's a 21-year-old lie that's going to take some time in revealing because American journalists, politicians, and generals remain totally unreliable fonts of Pentagon-fueled propaganda. Decades from now, the American people will finally learn how the Taliban, just like Saddam Hussein, had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. Americans will one day learn Bush knew all along Afghanistan and Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, but went ahead anyway and laid waste to entire peoples while our infrastructure crumbled at home. Right after the invasion of Iraq, a popular refrain heard among neoconservatives who never served a day in the military was, this is what they were saying: everyone wants to go to Baghdad, but real men want to go to Tehran. Real men want to go into Iran. No. Some men, knowing exactly who was responsible for 9/11, wanted to go to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, but the real men, they wanted to stay home. We had no business attacking Iraq or Afghanistan after 9/11. As I just said, back in 2008, Barack Obama got elected running on the lie that America dropped the ball by invading Iraq because, he lied, Afghanistan, quote, was ground zero for any war on terrorism. That's what Barack Obama said when he was running for election in 2008. Afghanistan is ground zero for any war on terrorism. That was and remains a lie, especially because 19 of the 9/11 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, and Egypt. None of the hijackers were from Iraq or Afghanistan. Zero. Most, if not all, of 9/11 was financed by Saudi Arabia. Afghanistan couldn't possibly fund 9/11 because it couldn't fund Afghanistan, which is why just 3 weeks ago, a U.S. judge ruled that 9/11 families were not entitled to half of Afghanistan's $7 billion in frozen assets because the country, the judge ruled, was never a state sponsor of terrorism. Saudi Arabia is a de facto state sponsor of terrorism, and it should have been their assets frozen after 9/11. It should have been their assets turned over to the families of the victims. Now, granted, the ruling party at the time in Afghanistan was the Taliban, and they did provide haven to Osama bin Laden during the lead up to 9/11. But so did other countries, especially Pakistan and bin Laden's homeland, Saudi Arabia, which financed the whole thing. After 9/11, one would think, why not invade Saudi Arabia? I mean, if Americans wanted revenge after 9/11, we were way more within our rights invading Saudi Arabia. But funny thing about Saudi Arabia, they're our friends. Yeah, the country behind 9/11, our buddies. We all have friends like that, right? Friends you help, and they say thanks by trying to destroy you. We were best friends forever with the Saudis, so much so that 10 years before they attacked us on 9/11, we fought a war against Iraq primarily to protect them from getting invaded after Saddam laid claim to Kuwait. We couldn't invade Saudi Arabia after 9/11 because it would look like that entire first Gulf War was all for naught, which it was. It would look like it was all for naught if the country we fought to protect returned the favor by flying jets into our Pentagon and World Trade Center, which, by the way, they did. Osama bin Laden, born in Saudi Arabia, financed 9/11 by Saudi Arabia. Most of my listeners already know that Saudi-born Osama bin Laden and his Saudi princes, of which there are thousands, and they funded his endeavors with their vast reserves of petrodollars, they all believed, all these Saudis, the princes, bin Laden, they all believed their homeland had been soiled by American soldiers who bin Laden referred to as infidels. Indeed, bin Laden clearly stated that one of the chief reasons he attacked us was because of the 500,000 American soldiers living in Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm. Turns out we're not the only ones who have a problem with foreigners flooding our border. Okay, so that's Saudi Arabia. Now, why didn't we invade Pakistan after 9/11? Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia, had more to do with 9/11 than Afghanistan or Iraq, which, in case you forgot, had nothing to do with 9/11. Nothing. Before 9/11 and after, Pakistan harbored and harbors a much larger network of terrorists than Afghanistan or Iraq combined. One of those terrorists Pakistan harbored was Osama bin Laden. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that Osama was safely tucked away in Abbottabad, Pakistan, when our CIA finally tracked him down and killed him in 2011. You might be surprised, however, to learn that immediately after bin Laden was killed, Dr. Shakil Afridi, the Pakistani medic who played a major role in identifying and then killing bin Laden, well, after bin Laden was killed, Dr. Shakil Afridi was sentenced to 33 years in prison by Pakistan's government on charges of treason. He languishes there in prison to this day because Osama bin Laden remains a very popular figure in certain parts of Pakistan. So why didn't we invade Pakistan after 9/11? We couldn't, because it became an impregnable nuclear power in 1998. The chief reason for invading Iraq in 2003, 20 years ago, was to keep it from becoming a nuclear power. And while Iraq never was a nuclear power, it's not because Pakistan didn't try to help it become one. In fact, Pakistan's chief nuclear scientist, Abdul Qadir Khan, AQ Khan, the father of Pakistan's atomic bomb, well, before 9/11, he created a vast and profitable network for himself and his country by selling and trading nuclear secrets and equipment with Iraq, as well as Iran, as well as Libya and North Korea. And before 9/11, our CIA already knew AQ Khan, his name is Abdul Qadir Khan, father of the atomic bomb in Pakistan. Before 9/11, our CIA already knew Khan was selling and trading the nuclear equipment and secrets with the tacit approval of Pakistan's government. So if Bush really wanted to stop the spread of nuclear weapons in Iraq or anywhere else, he should have started by invading Pakistan and grabbing Abdul Qadir Khan, who was eventually placed under house arrest in 2004 when he finally admitted what everyone in Pakistan already knew, that he was proliferating nuclear secrets around the world. When he did plead guilty, he insisted, "I was just following orders from my prime minister." He was eventually released after just 5 years, house arrest, 5 years house arrest, and died in 2021, hailed in Pakistan as a national hero. I'm absolutely certain no such scientist turned national hero ever existed in Iraq or Afghanistan before we invaded them. So clearly, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were the worthy targets after 9/11. I would have opposed that, but if you're looking for a worthy target, it's Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, or the Bush family compound in Kennebunkport, but that's for another episode. We knew who to blame. It was Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. But an administration of warmongering draft dodgers, was only going to pick a fight with countries they knew they could beat. And it turns out they couldn't even do that. Bush and Cheney couldn't even win in Iraq or Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Iraq got picked out of the chorus line because they both had piddling militaries. That's why we picked a fight with them. Even more importantly, their economies were so inconsequential. There was more money for Wall Street in destroying and rebuilding Afghanistan and Iraq than there was in forming peaceful economic partnerships that fostered trade and jobs. It was more profitable to just destroy and rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan. Bush knew that when it came to attacking Iraq and Afghanistan, there would be no economic or military downside, except for our soldiers, the innocent people living in those countries, and of course, American taxpayers who, as I mentioned earlier, will end up paying $7, $8, $9 trillion just on the interest alone for George W. Bush's deficit-financed war on terrorism. Remember, this is the idiot who told America that you could pay for a war, 2 wars, and a global war on terror by lowering taxes. Had a budget surplus when he took office. To review, because I know so much of this is hard to keep straight. To review, immediately after 9/11, the 2 countries America needed to worry about were Pakistan for harboring terrorists, as well as assisting rogue nations in becoming nuclear powers. The other country was Saudi Arabia for allowing its princes to use their vast reserves of petrodollars to finance Osama bin Laden's attacks on America. But instead, America attacked the 2 countries who had nothing to do with 9/11. And do not tell me I am dishonoring our soldiers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they already know what I'm telling you. They know they were lied to, and they also know you were lied to. If George Bush were telling the truth, he wouldn't have feared putting al-Qaeda on trial. That's why it's really important to note Osama bin Laden was not captured, he was killed. Last August, his second in command, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was also killed. I'm sorry, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. I forgot. The man is a healer, an ophthalmologist, I believe. You'd think he would have done something about Mullah Omar's eye, but we digress. Let me ask you, wouldn't you want to bring these 2 in alive, but no trials for them, or any of the masterminds of 9/11 who are being held to this day in Guantanamo Bay? Why? Weren't we spreading democracy? Isn't the cornerstone of democracy the right to a free and public trial? The Geneva Conventions say these masterminds must go on trial, or it's a war crime. Gitmo, according to the Geneva Conventions, is a war crime. Forget the waterboarding. Just not giving these men trials is a war crime. 9/11 was never going to be prosecuted in an open court of law because our government wasn't interested in getting to the bottom of it, because they already knew the bottom of it and they didn't want us to know it. That is why immediately after 9/11, when the Taliban repeatedly, and I do mean repeatedly, offered up Osama bin Laden, they knew where Osama bin Laden was hanging out. They repeatedly offered up bin Laden with the caveat that America had to agree to stop the air attacks. We were bombing Afghanistan right after 9/11. And more importantly, we had to agree to put Osama bin Laden on trial in a 3rd country. Bush rejected the idea. He said there was no need for a trial. In the days immediately following 9/11, when the Taliban was offering to turn over Osama bin Laden, Bush told the Taliban and the American people, there is no need to discuss it. We know he's guilty. Just turn him over. There's nothing to negotiate about. They're harboring a terrorist and they need to turn him over. Sounds like the Taliban were more reasonable than George W. Bush. I mean, the Taliban, you got to give them credit for being, for being incredibly unreasonable, batshit, crazy religious zealots. They were pretty reasonable. The Taliban did not brag or take credit for 9/11. They had a government to run. Bin Laden, however, did. And he was up in the hills of Afghanistan. They didn't sanction the attacks. Why would they? They knew what would happen. The Taliban knew exactly what would happen if they were behind 9/11. Bin Laden took credit for 9/11 repeatedly. There should have been trials. It would have kept us safer, and it would have continued the goodwill our entire planet expressed for us, including Iran, right after the attacks on 9/11. We needed at the time to model the right behavior. We needed, after 9/11, to signal to the world that even though America has been attacked, even though we can destroy the world several times over, even though we can do all that, instead, we choose to put the rule of international law first. Wouldn't that have been nice? That, and only that, would have built on the moral authority bequeathed to us after the Second World War. Instead, war criminal George W. Bush squandered everything his predecessors, including his father, who, like other World War II Navy veterans, President Jack Kennedy and President Richard Nixon, they all carried on Franklin Roosevelt's vision of making America safe by making it a respected global partner. George W. Bush destroyed all of that. 20 years ago this week, George W. Bush, war criminal, lied. And too many of us believed him. And I am ashamed to tell you, I sort of, almost, kind of, in a way, didn't believe him, but I kept saying nobody could be that evil. Nobody would lie this way and drum up a fake war. I can't imagine he being that evil. And 72% of Americans 20 years ago tonight supported shock and awe. They told Gallup they supported the invasion of Iraq, 72% of Americans, and they gave President George W. Bush, a war criminal, they gave him a 76% approval rating 20 years ago tonight. But the rest of the world didn't. The rest of the world did not approve. What so many Americans forget is that only America and Tony Blair believed Colin Powell's lies when he went before the UN General Assembly, claiming the war was necessary because Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was linked to 9/11. The rest of the world, including Powell's entire audience that day at the United Nations, except Tony Blair, the rest of the world, except Tony Blair, saw right through Colin Powell, and they refused to sign on. The rest of the world refused to join the coalition of the willing, as it was called back then. We went in there alone with Tony Blair. A week before the invasion, United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan warned that the war, the invasion of Iraq, was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council and was in direct violation of the UN Charter. When asked immediately after the invasion if Bush's folly was, quote unquote, illegal, was it illegal? The UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, said, quote, yes. At the same time, while we're during the buildup to the war, while Colin Powell was lying at the UN and the Bush administration was telling, what was it, close to 1,000 lies, sometimes under oath. While all this was going on, France, Germany, Russia, and China, along with foreign ministers from 22 Arab nations, but not Tony Blair, they all said they would offer zero assistance in the war effort. They pleaded with Bush to wait for the weapons inspectors to finish their job. Pope John Paul II joined the chorus, saying, quote, no to war. War, the Pope said, is not always inevitable. He added, war is always a defeat for humanity. Pope John Paul II, on the eve of America's criminal invasion of Iraq, said, war is always a defeat for humanity. 4 years later, parenthetically, and somewhat to his credit, Tony Blair converted to Catholicism. Just thought I'd mention that. Perhaps had he undergone the conversion 5 years earlier, we still would have invaded Iraq, but Tony Blair wouldn't have needed so many facelifts. And anyway, he got Iraq wrong. God, I hate Tony Blair. Panama Papers, anyone? How many offshore accounts? Tony Blair got Iraq wrong. Or he knew it was wrong, but went along while the rest of the entire world got it completely right. We forget that. The entire world, except for Tony Blair, got Iraq right. They knew George W. Bush was a liar and a criminal. And some Americans knew it. As Bush's war drums grew deafening, millions around the world took to the streets, forming the largest anti-war movement since Vietnam, some say even bigger. On the eve of the invasion, the New York Times famously wrote, quote, there may still be two superpowers on the planet, the United States and world public opinion. Millions of Americans also took to the streets. In New York City alone, right before the invasion, 200,000 New Yorkers protested in below freezing weather. And I can assure you we won't be out there tomorrow when Donald Trump is frog marched. We know him too well. Even George W. Bush's father, had serious misgivings about invading Iraq and tried to explain privately to his idiot son why he, in 1991, kept Saddam Hussein in power after kicking him out of Kuwait. Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor during the first Gulf War under George Herbert Walker Bush, penned an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal 6 months before the invasion. And it was very subtle. It was entitled, "Don't Attack Saddam." Apparently, Brent Scowcroft met George W. Bush and knew that you have to talk to him like an effing dog. Don't attack Saddam. That was the headline in the Wall Street Journal. I can't make this any clearer, paramecium brain. Don't attack Saddam. But as the invasion neared, the people who knew it was wrong, who could have stopped it, people like Scowcroft and George Herbert Walker Bush, they all fell silent and got in line. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who served in Vietnam and was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the first Gulf War, he knew invading Iraq again was a bad idea. And he also knew that he himself had the political capital to stop it. But instead, like I said, he went before the United Nations and lied. He knew he was lying, and he failed to convince the world. They didn't believe him. There was never any inevitability to our invasion of Iraq. The war in Iraq was the antithesis to World War I. World War I, where nations obeyed a series of protocols and treaties and marched mindlessly into an unstoppable conflagration. That was World War I. With Iraq, it was just one nation, America. And Tony Blair, who refused to follow the rules of international law. The rest of the world, except Tony Blair, they refused to cooperate. And even though America was wrong, it's important to remember the world order set up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, it held steady. But for America, the war in Iraq was Bush's choice. It could have been prevented, but the right people remained silent. The right people remained silent, and that makes them forever wrong. A newly elected president, John F. Kennedy, told Canadian lawmakers in 1961 that he had a problem with the adage, quote, he didn't like this quote. It's misattributed. People think it was Edmund Burke who said this. He didn't. But this is the adage that JFK did not like. Quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. JFK didn't like that. He didn't like the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Kennedy, in his speech in Canada, as he so often does, offered up wisdom for the ages. He said, and the syntax is a little off, so you might want to rewind this. It's flowery speech, so it may not be clear. So again, he's attacking the adage, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. This is what he said. The thing that strikes you about this saying, on a moment's reflection, is how little sense it makes. The silence of good men isn't the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil. The persons advancing the evil, whether in command or the rank and file, must be strong and determined, and the lukewarm must be either cowed into submission or willing to go along because the evil seems to prosper. It's poetic, but obtuse. The lukewarm must be either cowed into submission or willing to go along because the evil seems to prosper. If you don't quite grasp what he's trying to say, it's his fault. So as they say, let me unpack this, tease this out. Okay, the lukewarm. The lukewarm must be either cowed into submission or willing to go along because the evil seems to prosper. Is there any word better than lukewarm to describe the Americans who fully recognize something evil is about to or is happening, but refuse to jeopardize their standing in the community by speaking up and out against evil? The lukewarm. The lukewarm. Rewind this or look it up. It's so poetic. The persons advancing the evil, whether in command or the rank and file, must be strong and determined. And the lukewarm must be either cowed into submission or willing to go along because the evil seems to prosper. The lukewarm. He was something else. So in the immediate weeks leading up to the invasion of Iraq, America's lukewarm got on board, while our corporate-controlled media silenced our bravest voices, seasoned by previous wars and the Pentagon Papers. You couldn't hear from them. On the eve of destruction, the truly moral and patriotic voices were banished. And ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and MSNBC, they embedded their reporters with the invading army so they could only be able to repeat carefully crafted, upbeat talking points fed to them by the Pentagon. At home, the television anchors sought guidance and analysis from retired generals secretly working as lobbyists for weapons manufacturers. 20 years ago tonight, not one single person was permitted on network television, not one, to say, this won't end well because we're attacking the wrong country. Not one. Instead, 20 years ago tonight, Americans were fed a steady diet of war profiteer propaganda. 5 years after the invasion, while the war was still going on, the New York Times published an expose on how Pentagon and weapons makers put former high-ranking members of the military out front on network television to deliver false and buoyant assessments on how things are going in Iraq. The Times wrote, for example, John C. Garrett is a retired Marine colonel and unpaid analyst for Fox News TV and radio. He is also a lobbyist at Patton Boggs, who helps firms win Pentagon contracts, including in Iraq. And this continues to this day. CNN, MSNBC, they are constantly interviewing retired generals who never reveal that they work for the military-industrial complex. Even our best and our brightest reporters like Dan Rather and, sadly, Christopher Hedges, on the eve of the invasion, turned lukewarm. I love Christopher Hedges. Christopher Hitchens, that's a whole other story. He ended up all in on the invasion. Christopher Hedges. Right before the invasion, this pains me, right before the invasion, Christopher Hedges, then working as a New York Times reporter, helped PBS Frontline, in the production of a documentary where Hedges personally, on screen, presented evidence suggesting that Saddam Hussein might have helped train the 9/11 terrorists. I love Christopher Hedges. I read all his books. It proves even the best can be suckered by evil. Even the best among us can be suckered by evil. 6 days after 9/11, a tear-stricken CBS anchor, Dan Rather, abandoned all pretense of journalistic ethics by telling David Letterman, quote, George Bush is the president. He makes the decisions, and, as just one American, wherever he wants me to line up, just tell me where. Well, you weren't just one American. You were the anchor of the CBS Evening News. I have tremendous respect for Dan Rather, and he's made amends for this. But right after 9/11, it was Dan Rather's responsibility to remind Letterman's crowd that our Constitution specifically gives war-making powers to Congress, not the president. When commanders-in-chief act unilaterally, we end up with situations like, Iraq. Our Congress, pretty lukewarm. On October 11th, 2002, both houses gave President Bush a lukewarm authorization to invade Iraq, believing Bush would exhaust all other options before choosing the military one. The lukewarm authorization passed in the Senate, 77-23, and 296 to 133 in the House. There were a lot of people who knew Bush was lying, including JFK's brother, Teddy Kennedy. Teddy Kennedy voted against the war authorization. The war authorization, this was not a vote for war. It was instead a vote signifying confidence that George W. Bush, a draft dodger, would make the right decision on Iraq. The war authorization. This was not a vote for war. It was a lukewarm Congress abdicating any blame and responsibility should Bush go to war, and it turned out the way it did. They were voting not to be blamed for the war. The war authorization was not a vote for war. It was a lukewarm vote for political cover, which is why Bush insisted it be taken before the midterms. Before the midterms in 2002. Remember, we invaded in 2003. The war authorization, Bush tricked everybody into voting on it before the midterms. After the midterms would have been different, because in a lame duck session, lukewarm politicians can safely turn the heat up to boil with zero political implications. The Democrats, this is something people forget. This makes me, I'm sorry, but it makes me angry. The Democrats had control of the Senate in 2002 when the war authorization was passed. It was a democratically controlled Senate that gave George W. Bush his war authorization. No authorization, no war, period. Now, we all remember Colin Powell earlier as the one man in America who could have stopped the war. He had the political capital and the charisma. All he had to do was do something cinematic at the UN, hold up that fake vial of anthrax, and say, folks, this is bullshit. Well, that only happens in movies. But we always think Colin Powell was the only one who could have stopped the invasion. But there was another Vietnam veteran with even more political power and influence who could have stopped the invasion of Iraq. He was Senate Majority Leader and Democrat Tom Daschle. Ralph Nader ran for president in 2000 because Democrats had become a party of corporate stooges. Tom Daschle, 2 years later, proved him right. Daschle, Senator Tom Daschle, Democrat, Senate Majority Leader in 2002, had all the power to stop the war authorization. He could have insisted the vote take place after the midterms, when members of his own party didn't have to worry about appearing weak on defense. Instead, he agreed to take the vote right before the midterms, figuring it would help Democrats on election day if they were portrayed as being just as hawkish on war as the Republicans. There was political calculus at play. Daschle, unlike Ted Kennedy, voted for the war authorization. Well, not only was the Senate Majority Leader who could have stopped the war, not only was he completely wrong about the war authorization, he was also excruciatingly wrong on the political expediency of making Democrats vote before the midterms. It's a stupid move. Weeks later, Republicans won back the Senate, and 2 years later, Daschle lost re-election. But George W. Bush got the war authorization. So what does Tom Daschle do after he loses re-election in 2004 while the war has turned completely south and he knows he made a mistake? What does he do? What does the one man who could have stopped the Iraq war by refusing to hold the vote before the midterms, have it take place after the midterms in a lame duck session where there's more courage to be found in the Democratic Party, what does he do after it becomes abundantly clear he was wrong for supporting the war? Well, Tom Daschle took a job on K Street and became a lobbyist for the health insurance companies. That's how he did penance for voting for the war authorization, by becoming a lobbyist for the health insurance companies. Tom Daschle, Democrat, no pangs of regret, no interest in spending his free time working to end the killing in Iraq. Instead, he signed up on K Street to continue the killing in America by lobbying for the health insurance companies. The definition, Tom Daschle is the definition of a piece of shit. When all is said and done, I blame Iraq on George W. Bush, but I also blame Tom Daschle. It was never Colin Powell who could have stopped the march to war. Tom Daschle, Senate Majority Leader, he had all the power, and he refused. Yes, I obviously blame George W. Bush, but he was doing his job as a dumb Republican. He was a dumb Republican who had been humiliated after 9/11 and wanted vengeance. And he needed to appear tough and deflect attention away from how he completely ignored intelligence briefings and allowed the World Trade Center and our very own Pentagon to be attacked. It was Tom Daschle's responsibility to realize how weak a man George W. Bush was, how humiliated he was on 9/11, and rein him in. Because how is it remotely possible that after the trillions Americans spend on defense, the Pentagon, which is supposed to protect all of us, how is it possible that our Pentagon was that vulnerable? This was the ultimate humiliation for a weak cowboy like George W. Bush, and for a Bush administration populated by crypto-libertarians who believe the only role government really should play is keep us safe. Well, for people who think that the only role of government is a strong military that keeps Americans safe. 9/11 was an abject humiliation for them. And Daschle should have known that. He should have known that a dumb Republican was going to do the wrong thing, because they always do. Bush did, after 9/11, what any ill-tempered, white-knuckled drunk with little to no intellectual curiosity would do. Right? He would find someone else to blame other than himself. So Tom Daschle, Democratic Senate Majority Leader in 2002, didn't do his job. Instead, he gave a blank check to a newly elected, ill-equipped president with major league daddy issues. To her credit, Nancy Pelosi, who was then the Democratic whip in the House, Nancy Pelosi voted against the authorization. She said Bush, this is 2002, before the midterm, she had a safe seat in San Francisco. She said Bush had not used diplomacy to get other countries on board. Pelosi said invading Iraq would only exacerbate terrorism. She said, quote, now we're very critical on this show of Nancy Pelosi, but she voted against the war authorization. This is what she said. As the ranking Democrat on the House Select Committee on Intelligence, I have seen no evidence or intelligence that suggests that Iraq indeed poses an imminent threat to our nation. If the Bush administration has that information, they have not shared it with the Congress. Nancy Pelosi, who concludes, quote, if we invade Iraq, we will show our military power. If we can eliminate the threat posed by weapons of mass destruction without invading, we will show our strength. She got that right. And by 2006, Iraq was considered the single worst foreign policy blunder in American history. And Democrats in 2006 regained the House, and Bush fired Rumsfeld. Nancy Pelosi became Speaker and immediately turned lukewarm. She turned lukewarm by failing to defund the war, right? She wouldn't stop saying what a mistake it was and how right she was for not voting for the war authorization. But she was the Speaker, and she could have ended the war, this mistake. Her first year, 2007, she could have refused to back a $130 billion Iraq war supplemental spending bill. Every year there was a supplemental to fund the war. She could have voted no. No money, no war. No money, the troops come home, the United Nations goes in. It's really that simple. See, Democrats control the House, and you can't pass a spending bill without the House. Instead, Pelosi hid behind our troops. She would not bring them home because she wanted to protect the troops. Instead of a $130 billion war supplemental, which she supported as Speaker, she needed to do the right thing and pass, a $50 billion peace supplemental that covered all the costs of shipping our soldiers home from Iraq. But instead, right after winning the gavel and becoming Speaker, Pelosi mischaracterized the role she could play in ending the conflict. She acted as though her hands were somehow tied. She said, quote, this is right after she became Speaker, quote, let me remove all doubt in anyone's mind. As long as our troops are in harm's way, Democrats will be there to support. God, this makes me so angry. Let me remove, this is what she said. This is the definition of lukewarm that Jack Kennedy was talking about, right? She has the power to make sure the supplemental doesn't get passed. And she says, let me remove all doubt in anyone's mind. As long as our troops are in harm's way, Democrats will be there to support them, but we will have oversight over that funding. Lukewarm bullshit. It's, oh yeah, the troops are in harm's way, so we have to support the troops by passing the supplemental instead of saying, we'll pass a supplemental that brings the troops home. See, they hide behind the troops. Our troops were in harm's way. The war was a disaster. The speaker's oversight of the funding of the war should have explicitly stated in 2007, we will not authorize any more funding that goes towards keeping troops in Iraq. We will only authorize funding to bring them home. That's how you protect troops who are in harm's way, Nancy Pelosi. The troops are in harm's way. You pass a supplemental to bring them home from this criminal war. She, Nancy Pelosi, could have ended the war. She knew it was wrong. She voted against the war authorization. But when she had the power to stop it, to defund it, she stood silent. Lukewarm cowardice. And Nancy, your lukewarm cowardice is the kind that gets thousands and thousands more killed and maimed. This week, President Biden, who as senator also voted for the war authorization in 2002, is expected to sign a bill that cancels the war authorization after more than 20 years. More than 20 years. Do I need to review? Do I need to go over the lives lost, ruined, our soldiers maimed, suicidal? Nothing good came from the invasion of Iraq. Only death and suffering and suicides. Nothing good. And yet, Donald Trump is the ex-president who's going to get perp walked tomorrow. There's a guy in Texas, former president in Texas, painting wounded soldiers tonight, who should be handcuffed and taken to The Hague. But of course, America is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. How could we? Our presidents would all be at The Hague. No accountability in this country, none whatsoever. 2 weeks after the invasion of Iraq, when it looked like it was going to be a cakewalk, I think nuclear arms, I think it was Edelman who said it's going to be a cakewalk. And it looked like it was going to be a cakewalk 2 weeks in. And so MSNBC's Joe Scarborough, Morning Joe, if you're in politics, you got to go on Morning Joe. He is, for some reason, people love him. It's been around forever. MSNBC's Joe Scarborough wanted an apology after we invaded Iraq, and it seemed to be going so well. He was incensed. He had that bloodlust. He saw shock and awe, and we were going to win this thing. Former Congressman Joe Scarborough said on his show, quote, this was 20 years ago. This is what he said. I'm waiting to hear the words, quote, I was wrong. Scarborough says, I want to hear people say I was wrong from some of the world's most elite journalists, politicians, and Hollywood types. I just wonder who's going to be the first elitist to show the character to say, hey, America, guess what? I was wrong. Who was wrong, Joe? And then he said, and remember, this is just 2 weeks after the invasion of Iraq when it was supposedly going swimmingly. Joe Scarborough said, you all remember Scott Ritter? You know, the former chief UN weapons inspector who played chief stooge for Saddam Hussein? Well, Mr. Ritter actually told a French radio network that, quote, the United States is going to leave Baghdad with its tail between its legs, defeated. Sorry, Scott. I think you've been chasing the wrong tail again. Scott Ritter said there's no weapons, no WMDs. They never found them. He said the United States is going to leave Baghdad with its tail between its legs. Well, he got that wrong because by the time we left Iraq, our tail was shot off. Ritter and the UN was right. And the MSNBC pundits like Joe Scarborough and the neocons like Bill Kristol live happily ever after on MSNBC and CNN. The UN was absolutely right on Iraq, and it is right on Ukraine. You don't invade. War is a crime against humanity. All war, especially Iraq. But this week, we arrest Trump over hiding hush money paid to a porn star and pat ourselves on the back, calling America a nation of laws. Well, that's so funny. We're a nation of laws. So we're going to lock up the ex-president. By the way, if you're watching this, that's a picture of Stormy Daniels and her lawyer, Michael Avenatti. That's Michael Avenatti. He's been sentenced to 14 years in federal prison for hiding $11 million from his clients in the IRS. It's 14 years in prison. And you know why he got such a harsh sentence? He didn't steal enough. If only Avenatti stole $2 billion from Medicare, like Republican Rick Scott, he could have been elected senator from Florida. You got to steal more money, Michael. Otherwise, you go to prison. Thank you for listening. For a free transcript of today's show with citations, hyperlinks, sources, please subscribe to my newsletter. This will be sent out. I know a lot of things I said people don't believe, like the Taliban weren't behind 9/11. I know that's a hard sell. Subscribe to my newsletter, and you can go to the hyperlinks. Also, this Friday night at 8 p.m., Howie Klein from Down with Tyranny and I are hosting a fundraiser for Maybe a Girl, who is running for Adam Schiff's congressional seat in Los Angeles. If you're listening to this as a podcast or on any other platform, check the description of this episode. You'll find the Zoom link, and it's free. Come join our Friday night meetup. We've been having these for 3 years, and meet the great Howie Klein, my moral compass, and meet Maybe a Girl, who we want to send to Congress. Blue America endorses Maybe a Girl. She's running for California's 30th congressional district, and she is the first transgender politician ever elected to office in America. She holds a seat on the Silver Lake Community Council. and she's run for Congress before. She's thoroughly vetted by Blue America and Howie Klein. So come out and meet her. We have some new listeners, and I make myself available every Friday night at 8 p.m. at office hours. The link is in the description of this episode. Go to my website and hit the office hours link there. It'll be Dan will update it in about 12 hours, so it may not be there right now. And I'm available. I'll talk to all the audience members who want to talk to me about anything you want. But this Friday, it's Howie Klein and Maybe a Girl. And I look forward to meeting you. Please like this episode. And as I've said before, I read all your comments. So please, really does make for good reading. And I hit the heart next to the comments to prove that I've read it. But sometimes I don't always hit the heart if I'm, on a subway. So, but I read all your comments, and some of you might be able to tell that I get ideas for topics from your comments. The only reason you're listening to this show is because a friend of yours shared it with you through email or via social media. Because of the content and the subject matter, nobody's helping me. Sam Cedar helps me, but nobody's going to promote this show. So the only way we get the word out is by you copying and pasting the link to this episode, sharing it on social media, please, and or in an email to your friends. I also should mention that I end every episode by saying, stay strong and protect the weak. And we printed up some bumper stickers, but I'm not going to sell them and I'm not going to mail them to you. I don't have time. However, anyone who comes Friday night to the fundraiser for Maybe a Girl, if you show up and you donate $1, $10, $100, you will have mailed to you a Stay Strong and Protect the Weak bumper sticker. So it's a reason to show up. You don't have to donate, but meet Howie Klein and Maybe a Girl. I think that covers everything. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Thank you very much.